The Western Philosophy, Will Durant, Chapter 5, Voltaire, Section 4, Potsdam and Frederick. Those who could not come to him wrote to him. In 1736 began his correspondence with Frederick, then Prince, and not yet great. Frederick's first letter was like that of a boy to a king. Its lavish flattery gives us an inkling of the reputation which Voltaire, though he had not yet written any of his masterpieces, had already won. It proclaims Voltaire as the greatest man of France and a mortal who does honor to language. I count it one of the greatest honors of my life to be born the contemporary of a man of such distinguished attainments as yours. It is not given to every one to make the mind laugh. And what pleasures can surpass those of the mind? Frederick was a free thinker who looked upon dogmas as a king looks upon subjects, and Voltaire had great hopes that on the throne Frederick would make the Enlightenment fashionable, while he himself perhaps might play Plato to Frederick's Dionysus. When Frederick demurred to the flattery with which Voltaire answered his own, Voltaire replied, "A prince who writes against flattery is as singular as a pope who writes against infallibility." Frederick sent him a copy of the Anti-Machiavel, in which the prince spoke very beautifully of the iniquity of war, and of the duty of a king to preserve peace. Voltaire wept tears of joy over this royal pacifist. A few months later, Frederick made king, invaded Silesia, and plunged Europe into a generation of bloodshed. In 1745, the poet and his mathematician went to Paris, when Voltaire became a candidate for membership in the French Academy. To achieve this quite superfluous distinction, he called himself a good Catholic, complimented some powerful Jesuits, lied inexhaustibly, and in general behaved as most of us do in such cases. He failed, but a year later he succeeded and delivered a reception address, which is one of the classics of the literature of Europe. For a while he lingered in Paris, flitting from salon to salon and producing play after play. From Oedipe at 18 to Irene at 83, he wrote a long series of dogmas, some of them failures, most of them successes. In 1730, Brutus failed, and in 1732, Erie failed. His friends urged him to abandon the drama, but in the same year he produced Zaire, which became his greatest success. Mahomet followed in 1741, Merope in 1743, Semiramis in 1748, and Tancredi in 1760. Meanwhile, tragedy and comedy had entered his own life. After 15 years, his love for Mame du Chalet had somewhat thinned. They had even ceased to quarrel. In 1748, the Marquis fell in love with the handsome young Marquis de Saint Lambert. When Voltaire discovered it, he raged. But when Saint Lambert asked his forgiveness, he melted into a benediction. He had reached the crest of life now, and began to see death in the distance. He could not take it ill that youth should be served. Such are women, he said, philosophically, forgetting that there are such men too. I displaced Richelieu. Saint Lambert turns me out. That is the order of things. One nail drives out another, so goes the world. He wrote a pretty stanza to the third nail. Saint Lambert, it is all for thee. The flower grows, the rose thorns are all for me, for thee the rose. Then in 1749 came the death of Mame du Chalet in childbirth. It was characteristic of the age that her husband and Voltaire and Saint Lambert should meet at her deathbed with not one word of reproach, and indeed made friends by their common loss. Voltaire tried to forget his bereavement in work. For a time he busied himself with his Cyril de Louis XIV, but what rescued him from despondency was the opportune renewal of Frederick's invitation to come to his court at Potsdam. An invitation accompanied by 3,000 francs for traveling expenses was irresistible. Voltaire left for Berlin in 1750. It soothed him to find himself assigned to a splendid suite in Frederick's palace, and accepted on equal terms by the most powerful monarch of the age. At first, his letters were full of satisfaction. Writing on July 24 to D. Argenteuil, he describes Potsdam 150,000 soldiers, opera, comedy, philosophy, poetry, grandeur, and graces, grenadiers and muses, trumpets and violins, the suppers of Plato, society and liberty. Who would believe it? Yet it is very true. Years before, he had written, "Mon Durant, what a delightful life it would be to lodge with 3 or 4 men of letters, with talent and no jealousy. What imagination! To love one another, live quietly, cultivate one's art, talk of it, enlighten ourselves mutually. I picture to myself that I shall some day live in this little paradise." And here it was. Voltaire avoided the state dinners. He could not bear to be surrounded with bristling generals. He reserved himself for the private suppers to which Frederick later in the evening would invite a small inner circle of literary friends, for this greatest prince of his age yearned to be a poet and a philosopher. The conversation at these suppers was always in French. Voltaire tried to learn German, but gave it up after nearly choking, and wished the Germans had more wit and fewer consonants. One who heard the conversation said that it was better than the most interesting and best written book in the world. They talked about everything and said what they thought. Frederick's wit was almost as sharp as Voltaire's, and only Voltaire dared to answer him with that fitness which could kill without giving offense. One thinks boldly, one is free here, wrote Voltaire joyfully. Frederick scratches with one hand, but caresses with the other. I am crossed in nothing. I find a port after 50 years of storm. I find the protection of a king, the conversation of a philosopher, the charms of an agreeable man, united in one who for 16 years consoled me in misfortune and sheltered me from my enemies. If one can be certain of anything, it is of the character of the King of Prussia. However, in November of this same year, Voltaire thought he would improve his finances by investing in Saxon bonds, despite Frederick's prohibition of such investment. The bonds rose, and Voltaire profited, but his agent, Hirschi, tried to blackmail him by threatening to publish the transaction. Voltaire sprang at his throat and sent him sprawling. Frederick learned of the affair and fell into a royal rage. "I shall want him at the most another year," he said to La Mettrie. "One squeezes the orange and throws away the rind." La Mettrie, perhaps anxious to disperse his rivals, took care to report this to Voltaire. The suppers were resumed, but, wrote Voltaire, "the orange rind haunts my dreams. The man who fell from the top of a steeple, and finding the falling through the air soft, said, 'Good,' provided it lasts, was not as little as I am." He had desired a break, for he was as homesick as only a Frenchman can be. The decisive trifle came in 1752. Maupertuis, the great mathematician whom Frederick had imported from France with so many others in an attempt to arouse the German mind by direct contact with the Enlightenment, quarreled with a subordinate mathematician, Koenig, over an interpretation of Newton. Frederick entered into the dispute on the side of Maupertuis, and Voltaire, who had more courage than caution, entered it on the side of Koenig. "Unluckily for me," he wrote to Mame Denis, "I am also an author, and in the opposite camp to the king. I have no scepter, but I have a pen." About the same time, Frederick was writing to his sister, "The devil is incarnate in my men of letters. There is no doing anything with them. These fellows have no intelligence except for society. It must be a consolation to animals to see that people with minds are often no better than they." It was now that Voltaire wrote against Maupertuis his famous diatribe of Dr. Akakia. He read it to Frederick, who laughed all night over it, but begged Voltaire not to publish it. Voltaire seemed to acquiesce, but the truth was that the thing was already sent to the printer, and the author could not bring himself to practice infanticide on the progeny of his pen. When it appeared, Frederick burst into flame, and Voltaire fled from the conflagration. At Frankfurt, though in territory quite outside Frederick's jurisdiction, he was overtaken and arrested by the king's agents, and told that he could not go on until he surrendered Frederick's poem, the Palladium, which had not been adapted for polite society, and out cruelled Voltaire's puzzled itself. But the terrible manuscript was in a trunk which had been lost on the way, and for a week till it came, Voltaire was kept almost in prison. A bookseller to whom he owed something thought it an opportune moment to come and press for the payment of his bill. Voltaire, furious, gave him a blow on the ear, whereupon Voltaire's secretary, Coligny, offered comfort to the man by pointing out, "Sir, you have received a box on the ear from one of the greatest men in the world." Freed at last, he was about to cross the frontier into France, when word came that he was exiled. The hunted old soul hardly knew where to turn. For a time he thought of going to Pennsylvania. One may imagine his desperation. He spent the March of 1754 seeking an agreeable tomb in the neighborhood of Geneva, safe from the rival autocrats of Paris and Berlin. At last he bought an old estate called Les Délices, settled down to cultivate his garden and regain his health, and when his life seemed to be ebbing away into senility, entered upon the period of his noblest and greatest work. Section 5. Les Délices, the essay on morals. What was the cause of his new exile? That he had published in Berlin the most ambitious, the most voluminous, the most characteristic, and the most daring of his works. Its title was no small part of it. Essai sur les mœurs et vesprit des nations, et sur les principaux faits historiques depuis Charlie Margent, jusqu'à Louis XIII, an essay on the morals and the spirit of the nations from Charles Margny to Louis XIII. He had begun it at Cirey, for Mame du Chalet, spurred on to the task by her denunciation of history as she is writ. It is an old almanac, she had said. What does it matter to me, a French woman living on my estate, to know that Egil succeeded Haakon in Sweden, and that Ottoman was the son of Otto. I have read with pleasure the history of the Greeks and the Romans. They offered me certain pictures which attracted me, but I have never yet been able to finish any long history of our modern nations. I can see scarcely anything in them but confusion, a host of minute events without connection or sequence. 1,000 battles which settled nothing. I renounced a study which overwhelms the mind without illuminating it. Voltaire had agreed. He had made his Agnew said, "History is nothing more than a picture of crimes and misfortunes," and he was to write to Horace Walpole, July 15, 1768. Truly, the history of the Yorkists and Lancastrians and many others is much like reading the history of highway robbers. But he had expressed to Mame du Charlotte the hope that a way out might lie in applying philosophy to history and endeavoring to trace beneath the flux of political events the history of the human mind. Only philosophers should write history, he said. In all nations, history is disfigured by fable, till at last philosophy comes to enlighten men, and when it does finally arrive in the midst of this darkness, it finds the human mind so blinded by centuries of error that it can hardly undeceive it. It finds ceremonies, facts, and monuments heaped up to prove lies. History, he concludes, is after all nothing but a pack of tricks which we play upon the dead. We transform the past to suit our wishes for the future, and in the upshot, history proves that anything can be proved by history. He worked like a miner to find in this Mississippi of falsehoods the grains of truth about the real history of mankind. Year after year, he gave himself to preparatory studies, a history of Russia, history of Charles XII, the age of Louis XIV, and the age of Louis XIII, and through these tasks he developed in himself that unflagging intellectual conscience which enslaves a man to make a genius. The Jesuit Pierre Daniel, who produced a history of France, had placed before him in the Royal Library of Paris 1,200 volumes of documents and manuscripts. Spent an hour or so looking through them, and then turning to Father Tournemine, the former teacher of Voltaire, dismissed the matter by declaring that all this material was useless old paper which he had no need of for the purpose of writing his history. Not so Voltaire. He read everything on his subject that he could lay his hands on. He pored over hundreds of volumes of memoir. He wrote hundreds of letters to survivors of famous events, and even after publishing his works, he continued to study and improved every edition. But this gathering of material was only preparatory. What was needed was a new method of selection and arrangement. Mere facts would not do event if, as so seldom happens, they were facts. Details that lead to nothing are to history what baggage is to an army. Impedimenta, we must look at things in the large for the very reason that the human mind is so small and sinks under the weight of minutiae. Facts should be collected by analysts and arranged in some kind of historical dictionary where one might find them as need. As one finds words, what Voltaire sought was a unifying principle by which the whole history of civilization in Europe could be woven on the thread. And he was convinced that this thread was the history of culture. He was resolved that his history should deal not with kings, but with movements, forces, and masses, not with the nations, but with the human race, not with wars, but with the march of the human mind. Battles and revolutions are the smallest part of the plan. Squadrons and battalions conquering or being conquered, towns taken and retaken are common to all history. Take away the arts and the progress of the mind, and you will find nothing in any age remarkable enough to attract the attention of posterity. I wish to write the history not of wars but of society, and to ascertain how men lived in the interior of their families, and what were the arts which they commonly cultivated. My object is the history of the human mind, and not a mere detail of petty facts. Nor am I concerned with the history of great lords, but I want to know what were the steps by which men passed from barbarism to civilization. This rejection of kings from history was part of that democratic uprising which at last rejected them from government. The essayist Sir Les Maistres began the dethronement of the Bourbons. And so he produced the first philosophy of history, the first systematic attempt to trace the streams of natural causation in the development of the European mind. It was to be expected that such an experiment should follow upon the abandonment of supernatural explanations. History could not come into its own until theology gave way. According to Buckle, Voltaire's book laid the basis of modern historical science. Gibbon, Niebuhr, Buckle, and Roth were his grateful debtors and followers. He was the output nearly of them all, and is still unsurpassed in the field which he first explored. But why did his greatest book bring him exiles? Because by telling the truth, it offended everybody. It especially enraged the clergy by taking the views later developed by Gibbon, that the rapid conquest of paganism by Christianity had disintegrated Rome from within and prepared it to fall an easy victim to the invading and immigrating barbarians. It enraged them further by giving much less space than usual to Judea and Christendom, and by speaking of China, India, and Persia, and all their faiths with the impartiality of a Martian. In this new perspective, a vast and novel world was revealed. Every dogma faded into relativity. The endless East took on something of the proportions given it by geography. Europe suddenly became conscious of itself as the experimental peninsula of a continent and a culture greater than its own. How could it forgive a European for so unpatriotic a revelation? The king decreed that this Frenchman, who dared to think of himself as a man first and a Frenchman afterward, should never put foot upon the soil of France again. This section is over.